welcome to your first U.S. Constitution video. I hope you enjoyed that little beginning by the Beatles talking about the Constitution. So let's get to it. The United States Constitution, we know, was not the first attempt at self-government in the United States. That was the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you associate the Articles of Confederation with one word, I want you to think of it as weak. Okay, the Articles of Confederation created a very weak central government, which is one of the reasons that eventually led to its demise. So let's first talk about some weaknesses that the Articles of Confederation had. It was not allowed to coin money. Now, what does it mean to coin money? That means to print or make money, okay? So there was no federal currency during the Articles of Confederation, which means that each state created their own money. So you would have different money if you were in Maryland or Virginia, okay? It made interstate commerce extremely, extremely difficult. It also could not regulate trade, okay? So it couldn't regulate trade. It also couldn't tax. Both of those things together mean that the federal government can't make money. So if the federal government can't make money, what can they really do? The federal government also could not enforce any decisions that it made, which is really difficult. If there were any disagreements between states, the federal government could simply suggest a solution to those problems, but couldn't do anything about it. It's kind of tricky. Even with all of those weaknesses, the Articles of Confederation did accomplish a few great things. First of all, it accomplished the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1783, and that was the treaty that ended the war with Great Britain. So it was kind of a big deal that we were able to do that. The Articles of Confederation also, under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was able to pass the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and that basically allowed for the inclusion of more territory and allowing that territory to eventually be turned into states. So it allowed the United States to expand. Also, under the Articles, the executive departments were created. So you have the Executive Department of Foreign Affairs, of War, of the Marines, of the Treasury, and all of those, some of those different departments that we still have today. So it did do some good things, just a few though. So in 1786, the founders met in Annapolis, Maryland, basically to come to some sort of conclusion about what do we do with this huge problem that the federal government has in not being able to enforce decisions and not being able to regulate trade. So the Annapolis Convention, it only comprised 12 delegates who came from 5 different states. So it definitely was not this huge continental association. And the Annapolis Convention convened with a resolution made by, it ended with a resolution made by Alexander Hamilton to meet again the following year to discuss amending the Articles of Confederation. They realized that it was just so weak and it didn't have enough authority, so they're like, okay, we've got to change this. We've got to do something else. So in July of 1787, our founders meet in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Now, the Constitutional Convention is eventually called the Miracle in Philadelphia, simply because it's a miracle that we were able to get anything done and that the government that we created is still functioning today. It's like mind-blowing. Anyway, so the Constitutional Convention starts off with a lot of different ideas, okay? The way our government is set up today, it didn't start off that way. Like somebody didn't just walk in and say, okay, this is how we're going to do things. And everybody else goes, okay, sounds great. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of discourse, a lot of arguing, and a lot of compromises that were made to get us where we are today. So the first plan that I want to talk to you about is the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan was proposed by a guy named James Madison. Now, if you've studied early American history at all, ever, you will have heard of James Madison. He's a pretty cool guy. So James Madison comes to the Constitutional Convention with this plan for how we're going to set up our government. And the Virginia Plan basically called for a bicameral legislature, bicameral, B-I-C-A-M-E-R-A-L, bicameral legislature, which means we had 2 houses in our legislative branch, okay? And it also called for representation in those houses to be based on the population of the state. So representation based on population. Okay, now the Virginia plan would have definitely benefited states with a larger population because the more people you have in your state, the more representation you have in Congress, so the more voice you have in your legislative branch. Another proposal called the New Jersey Plan was brought by William Patterson, and the New Jersey Plan was something that was going to benefit a small state. Okay, so the New Jersey Plan called for a unicameral legislature. UNI prefix means uni, one. Okay, so a unicameral legislature in which every state had equal representation. So it didn't matter how many people you had living in your state, everybody had the same amount of representatives, meaning everyone had the same voice in the legislative branch. Now, if you're a small state like New Jersey, you're going to look at that and say, hey, it sounds like a good plan. If you're a large state like Virginia, you're saying, no, that's wrong. We can't do that because that's not going to benefit us. So what we have, which is kind of a theme of the Constitutional Convention, is the Connecticut Compromise. Now, sometimes the Connecticut Compromise is called the Great Compromise, so I would know both of those terms. But the Great Compromise basically takes parts of the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. We have, from the Virginia plan, a bicameral legislature, which means we have two houses, okay? And in the first house, the House of Representatives, we have representation based on population. So if you're a hugely populated state like Virginia, then you have a lot of representatives. In the other house, the Senate, we have equal representation, which means it doesn't matter how many people live in your state, you get one, or you get the same amount of representatives in the Senate. So every state gets 2 senators no matter what, okay? So that's why we call it a compromise, because it took parts from both of those plans. Next we have the 3/5 compromise. Now this is basically the Founding Fathers' way of dealing with the issue of slavery, okay? So instead of totally abolishing slavery across the country or allowing slavery across the country, they come up with the 3/5 compromise to appease or to make the southern states happy, okay? So according to the 3/5 compromise, if you're a slave owner in the southern states, then you can count 3/5 of your slaves towards representation and taxing purposes. Okay, so that doesn't mean that 3/5 of those slaves became citizens. It doesn't mean that 3/5 of those slaves were free or anything like that. It just means that if you have 100 slaves, okay, and according to the 3/5 compromise, you can count 60 of those slaves towards representation purposes. So basically towards your population. Okay. Now, we had some other compromises as well, dealing specifically with electing the president, and we'll talk about electing the president and how the Electoral College works in class. So if you guys have any questions, let me know.